whopping 50 million new classified documents are created. Classified materials typically fall into one of three categories: confidential, secret, or top secret, based on their perceived sensitivity. Although there are existing requirements to automatically disqualify documents after 25 years, in practice, that process is ineffective. And there are currently a backlog of hundreds of millions of pages that are awaiting declassification. Along with outdated technology, the result is an overburdened classification system that costs taxpayers more than $18 billion a year to maintain. Experts, both within and outside of the federal government, estimate that between 50 and 90% of all classified material could be made public without compromising national security, and that the overclassification of documents reduces transparency and erodes public confidence in the federal government. Today's hearing is an opportunity for the committee to hear from experts on how Congress can modernize the classification system to improve efficiency and promote better transparency for the American people. We'll be discussing proposed reforms, including several recommendations from the National Archives Public Interest Declassification Board to help streamline our national classification and declassification processes. For example, investing in advanced technology, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, could help agencies better manage classified information, better serve the public, and meet the needs of the future. Other proposed reforms could help reduce the number of classified materials and levels of classification, establish automated declassification tools, and provide an expedited declassification request process for lawmakers, all of which would improve transparency and ensure Congress and the public can hold federal agencies more accountable. I'm interested in pursuing bipartisan legislation to help tackle some of these concerns, and I hope my colleagues will join me in these efforts. I certainly fully appreciate the engagement of Ranking Member Paul and his staff and believe that we can find a bipartisan path on these important issues. I look forward to having a very productive discussion with all of you here today so we can begin this process of reform, and I look forward to the answers to our questions. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Ranking Member Paul for his opening remarks.
26 years ago, a bipartisan Senate commission chaired by the late Senator Moynihan warned that excessive government secrecy and overclassification have significant consequences for the national interest. The commission found that secrecy is the ultimate mode of regulation, for the citizen does not even know that he or she is being regulated. So what happened in the decades since the commission recommended Congress reassert its authority and reform the executive branch classification system? Well, the problem got even worse. Executive branch officials from both political parties continue to arbitrarily overclassify government information to prevent oversight and withhold information from the public. Both parties are guilty of this. According to the National Archives and Records Administration, in 2017, over 4 million Americans with security clearances classified nearly 50 million documents, a system that cost the American taxpayers over $18 billion. President Biden's own Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, acknowledged the overclassification problem on numerous occasions. As Director Haines said in January of this year, overclassification undermines the basic trust that the public has in government. There is no better example of undermining public trust than the federal government's continued refusal to share with the American people information about the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Department of Energy recently shifted its position on COVID-19 origins and joined the FBI in concluding that the pandemic was most likely the result of a lab leak. The FBI director later publicly confirmed the FBI's position that the pandemic most likely originated in the lab. If not for transparency, if not for whistleblowing, if not for the media getting a hold of this information, it would still be classified. Realize how crazy it is that they've classified a conclusion, not the source, not even the data. They classified the conclusion. They weren't even telling us that the FBI and the DOE had come to this conclusion. So recently, Congress showed strong bipartisan support for the need for transparency on origins of COVID-19 by unanimously passing a bill requiring the Director of National Intelligence to declassify information from the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the origins of COVID-19. I'm glad that President Biden signed the bill into law earlier this week. However, President Biden only committed to declassifying and sharing information consistent with his constitutional authority to protect against the disclosure of information that would harm national security. And that sounds good, but it also might be an excuse for not declassifying a lot of information. Given the administration's track record on transparency, I'm concerned that the president's statement suggests he will not publicly release all the information that exists. And it isn't just classified information. The executive branch is withholding from the American people on COVID origins. Most of what I've asked for is unclassified, and they're still resisting. Nearly a dozen federal agencies, including the Departments of Health and Human Services, State Department, Defense Department, and the FBI, refused to disclose thousands of records in their possessions relevant to the origins of COVID-19. Many of these records aren't classified. I've sent dozens of letters over 2 years to federal agencies requesting these records only to be stonewalled. In fact, recently disclosed emails made available by the Freedom of Information Act actually show that the Defense Threat Reduction Agency employees in private emails were scheming to obstruct my request, mentioning me by name and saying, we're not going to give any information to this guy. The American people deserve transparency and accountability. If we are being asked to sacrifice these values in the name of national security, that definition should be narrowly tailored to protect only what is necessary to preserve our sources and methods. In the Pentagon Papers case, Justice Potter Stewart remarked upon the wisdom of avoiding secrecy for its own sake. In his concurring opinion, Justice Stewart wrote, "When everything is classified, then nothing is classified, and the system becomes one to be disregarded by the cynical or the careless and to be manipulated by those intent on self-protection or self-promotion." I want to thank our consensus witness panel today for being here today. My hope is, Mr. Chairman, that we have a unique opportunity to address overclassification by the executive branch in a bipartisan way. I think any reform, though, has to be us taking back some power. If we leave it up to, please, executive branch, please give us information, it won't work. There has to be a hammer, and we have to take back some of the power. It originally was ours. We've let it drift away from us. We got to grab back that congressional authority. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Paul. It's the practice of the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses, so if each of you would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony that you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Thank you. You may be seated. Our first witness is Elizabeth Goitein. Ms. Goitein is the Senior Director of the Brennan Center for Justice, Liberty, and National Security Program and is regarded as a national expert in government transparency, presidential emergency powers, and government surveillance. Previously, Ms. Goitein worked as a counsel to former Senator Russ Feingold and practiced as a trial attorney in the federal programs bench of the Civil Division of the Department of Justice. Welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to testify. Overclassification is a fact, not a theory. Insiders have estimated that 50 to 90% of classified information could safely be made public, as you said, Chairman. And the current system for declassification has no hope of keeping pace with the petabytes of classified information that agencies generate each year. The harms that result from this state of affairs are every bit as real and as serious as those that can result from the unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. Overclassification throws a wrench into the workings of democracy. It prevents the American people from weighing in on matters that affect their rights and their security. It undermines the rule of law by providing a shield for government misconduct, and it impedes oversight by Congress and the courts. Overclassification also harms national security. It limits the sharing of threat information, both within and outside government. It also causes officials to lose respect for the system. That, combined with the sheer volume of classified information, can lead busy officials to cut corners or simply make mistakes when it comes to the protection of classified information. The causes of overclassification are easy to identify. There are multiple incentives unrelated to national security to keep information secret. Classifying by rote is easier and faster than giving careful thought to every decision. Classification can be a key weapon in turf wars between agencies. It can be used to hide government conduct that's illegal, embarrassing, or just controversial. Perhaps above all, officials face harsh penalties for failing to protect sensitive information, but no official has ever faced serious consequences for overclassifying. Solving this set of problems will require fundamental changes to the current system. Although classification policy is usually set by executive order, presidents have historically been reluctant to take the bold steps that are needed. That's why Congress should consider stepping in. The U.S. Constitution gives Congress shared power with the president over national security matters, and Congress has passed many laws regarding the handling of national security information. Congress thus has ample authority to enact the measures we'll be discussing today. Chief among these is the development and implementation of advanced technologies to facilitate declassification and derivative classification, namely applying markings to information that's already been designated as classified. There is broad consensus among experts that we cannot and will not solve the system's problems without the help of technology. Pilot projects have shown that the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence to identify classified information and information that's subject to declassification has tremendous promise. But getting this off the ground will require leadership and resources. Congress can ensure that we have both. Congress should also direct the president to convene a committee of senior agency officials tasked with narrowing the criteria for classification. Original classification authorities must be able to exercise discretion, but that discretion should not be unbounded. The criteria set forth in the current executive order are too broad to provide meaningful constraints. In addition, pending the deployment of technological tools for declassification, Congress should authorize the National Declassification Center to declassify documents at 25 years without lengthy review by multiple agencies. This multi-agency review is inconsistent with the automatic declassification required by the executive order. And it's brought the system to its knees, producing long delays and massive backlogs that will continue to balloon as agencies generate more and more classified information. Finally, Congress should build accountability into the system. It should direct agencies to implement systems to identify and hold accountable those officials who knowingly, willfully, or negligently overclassify. The designation of classified information, proper designation, should be part of the performance evaluations of all officials who handle classified information. And agencies should be required to implement spot audits, which will help to foster a culture of accountability. My written testimony includes some other recommendations, but I'll stop there for now. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Secretary, thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Our next witness is Thomas Blanton. Mr. Blanton is the director of the National Security Archive at George Washington University, where he has served for over 30 years. In his role, he has conducted numerous investigations and published reports, books, and articles related to government transparency. Mr. Blanton led the National Security Archive to be the top nonprofit user of the Freedom of Information Act, and the archive has made more than 60,000 FOIA requests to the federal government. Welcome to the committee. You may begin with your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Dr. Paul and other members of the committee. I'm here to make 5 points in 5 minutes. Overclassification is out of control. Declassification has collapsed. Core functions in the National Archives that could help have been flatlined budget-wise for nearly 30 years, 5 different presidents. Key reform tools needed by this Congress and by the public are shriveling at the National Archives. And the key potential reform that could modernize the system is putting sunsets on secrets. On the front end, to force better thinking, and on the back end, to have automatic release. Those are my 5 core points. I won't belabor the first one. Chairman Peters, Dr. Paul, Liza all made the case on overclassification. I don't need to go much further except to say one thing. I applaud that COVID origins bill, but it has a giant hole that the intelligence community is going to run right through because the last phrase of it says we leave it up to the executive on sources and methods. Congress can do a different standard on sources and methods. They did it in the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board. They said you got to show harm and you got to weigh a cost and benefit between public benefit, congressional interest, public interest, and the damage done to any source and methods. But a flat sources and methods protection, which is built into so many statutes, is one of the main drivers of the overclassification crisis. Declassification has collapsed. Last year, I filed a Freedom of Information request with the George W. Bush Library. For one meeting the president had with a bunch of outside experts, none of them with security clearances, to prep for his first meeting with Vladimir Putin. They wrote back, we found 1,600 pages of classified documents on this meeting with uncleared outsiders. And by the way, it's going to take us 12 years to get that into the queue at the National Declassification Center. So 20-year-old documents and 12 more years to wait. That's the core argument I would make. You got to have an automatic sunset or I'll never see those documents, right? Third, core functions of the National Archives have flatlined. We did an audit on the budgets. There's a lot of different ways to measure this, but we tried to take a consistent one over 30 years, and we see that 5 presidents, the Congress, and the leadership of the archives have flatlined the budget, literally, despite an exponential increase in the records the National Archives is responsible for. Bush 41 left 80 gigabytes of records to the National Archives. Donald Trump left 250 terabytes. It's just... And meanwhile, the amount of money National Archives has to deal with that has been flatlined in real dollar terms. And that's starving, my 4th point, the key reform pieces of the National Archives that make a difference. This gentleman was the head of the Information Security Oversight Office. It's the best investment the Congress could make, is to give that office the resources it needs to be the inside watchdog on the secrecy system. That office staffs the Public Interest Declassification Board. That could be your go-to place. When you got a dispute with agencies on classified records, take them to that board for an objective judgment. But without staffing, without its own budget, without terms that continue until a new appointee is named, that board is withering away. The Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel, ISCAP, we love this jargon, ISCAP, Leon Trotsky, whatever, is the best single secrecy form that came out of the 1990s. We got to appeal to this interagency group of bureaucrats when an agency stiffed us, and that panel ruled for us 75% of the time. That's a measure of the overclassification from the insiders. What they proved, that panel proved, was you take the decision out of the cold, dead hands of the originating agency, and you get some rationality. Right? 75% was released. But that panel is withered away. Its success became its doom. It's overloaded with requests, backlog of 1,317 cases. I'm sorry, it doesn't work. Got to have more resources. Got to have the Information Security Oversight Office pushing it. And the last but not least, the National Declassification Center, it doesn't work. The original idea is that was going to be that interagency panel writ large. It was going to have the authority to declassify. So all the agencies would send their people to that center to sit at the same table and make decisions together. Doesn't work. Huge backlogs. Recent quote from a former employee, the National Declass Center is afraid of its own shadow. It doesn't have the power to push the agencies around, so the agencies push it around. Congress can change that and make a difference. And the last point, in my last 20 seconds, sunsets. Sunsets on secrets. On the front end, to force original classifiers to establish a date. When does the risk diminish? When does it start to go away? We've had a test on that, this 10-year or less rule. I think it worked. We haven't seen it in historic records, but it could work. On the back end, it's the only way to get rid of that enormous backlog of hundreds of millions of records. I'll leave it there. And in the question, I hope I can tell you about the machine learning experiment I ran yesterday, inspired by Liza's optimism about how computers are going to make a difference. And we'll come back to that. But thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Mr. Blanton. The next witness is John Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick serves as the former director of the Information Security Oversight Office, the office within the National Archives and Records Administration that leads efforts to standardize and assess our nation's efforts to manage many aspects of the classification system. Mr. Fitzpatrick has extensive experience within the federal government, including leadership positions dealing with classification policy. Previously, Mr. Fitzpatrick worked at the National Security Council, where he chaired the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel and the Records Access and Information Security Policy Coordination Committee. Mr. Fitzpatrick, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, Dr. Paul, members of the committee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss changes needed to modernize the government's classification system. As noted, I served in the U.S. government for 35 years, all of it in national security and intelligence, retiring in 2019. The last dozen or so of those years at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, as Director of ISOO, and on the National Security Council staffs of the Obama and Trump administrations were concerned with security and classification policies of the U.S. government and their implementation. As demonstrated already, there's no shortage of opportunity for change and improvement in the government's classification enterprise. I wish to make clear I believe the possibility for change and improvement of the system is real. I emphasize how congressional action, and specifically this committee's role, is urgently needed to send the demand signal for that change. I draw an analogy to the role of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, IRTPA, of 2004, that it played in instigating improvements to the security clearance process across government. That law, and this committee's role in overseeing its implementation, presented a clear mandate for change. It required the President to designate a single official as responsible for driving that change and establish strict performance measures and reporting timelines. I played a role in designing the approach and implementing the structure put in place to respond to those IRTPA requirements, and witnessed the necessity of having both the congressional mandate and the single presidential designee to drive change. Any successful effort to modernize the classification system will require the concerted efforts of top administration functions to formulate and drive change. Specifically, OMB and NSC Focus and Drive will be required to sustain collective reform efforts among departments and agencies. I consider it essential that any legislative mandate should require a single responsible official be designated by the President as accountable for the government-wide effort. Without top-of-government accountability, prospects for progress are few. As Tom pointed out, another essential element of reform is strengthening ISOO's position to meet the challenge of significant reform. Specifically, deliberate efforts are required to increase ISOO's prominence within and among the national security departments and agencies, specifically through greater utilization by NSC and OMB, and preferably that presidential designee. Increase ISOO's own resources and ensure it has independent control of same. ISOO's resources have dwindled over time, and a reform effort such as this would include right-sizing and empowering ISOO to ensure it's able to meet its mission. Retaining ISOO's role in administering both the Public Interest Declassification Board and Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel, and designating the ISOO Director to co-lead the development of a technology investment strategy with OMB and the Office of the Federal Chief Information Officer. As the committee is aware, the proportions of overclassification are practically immeasurable and owes to a range of factors, including the decades-long under-resourcing of the staffs and programs in place at departments and agencies whose jobs are to consider classification and declassification actions. I believe that the need to invest in technology to support improved classification and declassification is the single most important need in this modernization effort. The success of reform will depend on the creation of capabilities in the existing and future information environments across government. They must utilize emerging and maturing technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning to facilitate the review of classified current holdings, to engage classification decisions at the time of document creation with the intent of thwarting overclassification, and to suggest new ways to process digital records and alleviate future backlogs before they are built. I do not portray these observations about the poverties of the current system, nor the criticality of technological investment as in any way new. And as the board is already aware, I also commend the work of the Public Interest Declassification Board, what it has done to present a menu of opportunities to achieve strategic change. A prominent and fortified governance structure could use these ideas to guide the application of new technological capabilities to achieve reform. I'll close by thanking the committee for its efforts and to bring attention and drive action to these needed reforms, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. Our final witness is Patrick Eddington. Mr. Eddington serves as the senior fellow at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on homeland security and civil liberties-related issues. He also serves as the adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University Center for Security Studies. Earlier in his career, he served as a military imagery analyst at the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center, where he earned several accolades from the Joint Special Operations Command and Joint Warfare Analysis Center and the CIA's Office of Military Affairs. Mr. Eddington, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Dr. Paul, members of the committee, my sincere thanks for inviting me to be here today with some old friends and hopefully some new ones as well, to offer my views on this absolutely critical issue of overclassification by the executive branch. Let me state at the outset that the views that I express here today are strictly my own and do not necessarily represent the views of the Cato Institute, its management, or its board of directors. I got my first secret clearance as a young Army armor officer in 1986, followed by a top secret special compartmented information clearance for nearly 9 years as a CIA analyst, as the chairman mentioned, and then a top secret clearance as a House staffer for over 10 years. So I understand our classification system and its pitfalls very, very well. In my longer prepared statement, I provide the committee with some key historical background on how we got to this point, some of which you've already heard from some of my fellow panelists today. How our government creates and fails to release in a timely way literally millions of pages of federal records. You will also find in that statement a lengthy list of examples where executive branch secrecy has been used to hide major unconstitutional intelligence programs, as well as the failures of those programs and others actually authorized under the Patriot Act. Because the Congress has before it the pending business of whether to reauthorize or let die FISA Section 702, I want to use my remaining time to offer this warning. When the New York Times exposed then-President George W. Bush's illegal Stellar Wind electronic mass surveillance program in December of 2005, he and his key advisors assured the nation that the program was both necessary and effective. In fact, it was neither. Something we only learned from still more New York Times reporting that surfaced, and only through federal Freedom of Information Act lawsuits, I'll add, Intelligence Community Inspector General reports that revealed clearly that Stellar Wind was an ineffective program and one that collected data on Americans with no connections to terrorist groups or hostile foreign intelligence services. On June 6th, it will be 10 years since the Guardian newspaper published NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden's first major revelation, the federal government's programmatic collection of telephone metadata on virtually every American. The program made a mockery, and I use that word advisedly, a mockery of the Fourth Amendment's individualized, particularized, probable cause-based warrant requirement. The Patriot Act Section 215 telephone metadata program was also a failure, something former Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Patrick Leahy demonstrated in a 213 oversight hearing in which, after less than 5 minutes of cross-examination, the chairman got then NSA Deputy Director John Inglis to admit that contrary to previous NSA claims, that 54 terrorist plots on America had been stopped by that Section 215 program. The actual number was 0. It would not be until 2019 that NSA would finally kill that failed program. The executive branch's reaction to Snowden's revelations was to once again prosecute a whistleblower for exposing federal government domestic surveillance misconduct. Snowden, Thomas Tamm, the Stellar Wind whistleblower, and former Army Captain Christopher Pyle, who exposed long-running unconstitutional Army domestic surveillance in 1971 to the late Senator Sam Ervin and his committee, all acted out of a belief that the federal government's classification system was being used in a systematic way to conceal illegal or unconstitutional acts. They developed a contempt for a system that seemed designed to violate Americans' rights not protect them. As an author and historian, I have a keen interest in getting the tens of millions of still classified or otherwise unreviewed FBI, CIA, NSA, and related agency records into the public domain. And my statement for the record contains a model legislative proposal that I believe would accomplish that end. But even more fundamental to the preservation of the rights of our citizens is the need for a statutory ban on the misuse of the classification system to conceal waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, or violations of statute or provisions of the Constitution. I believe that my proposal would achieve that goal as well. I thank the members for their time and attention, and I stand ready to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Eddington. Mr. Fitzpatrick, in your testimony, you discussed the exponential increase in digital classified information, and all of our panelists have concurred with that. I'm always struck by the fact we're seeing an estimated 50 million new classified records each year. It's really hard to wrap your mind around the sheer volume of that. And most of all these records are now electronic, not pieces of paper like we think about with the rules as existed not too long ago. So if you could tell the committee, what are some of the major challenges that we face in managing classified information that is digital specifically?
Thank you for the question. So one of the reasons those numbers are so high is because in the post-9/11 era, and just with the development of technology, network technology in general, we have proliferated secret and top-secret information networks to support the activities of a larger national security and homeland security portion of government, and the industrial base that participates in it. So there are simply more ways and more direct ways for the 4.5 million people that have a security clearance to create a classified record. And the template for every one of them on those networks says, what's the classification level, and provides a tool to assist in choosing to classify that record. It does not say, does this need to be classified, yes, no, what harm would come from this. It is simply a digital recitation of whatever the other document was, an email that comes to you already classified, and I reply, I add no additional classified information to it, that email is also marked as classified. And so in the counts that ISOO attempts to do with some accuracy, they get harder and harder to do because you have created, proliferated digital classified items. That's done, that infrastructure and the culture that the users across the government live in is one of protection. Your job is not to release this information. Your job is to protect this information. There's a one-way incentive structure in place. And so there's a culture change needed that can only come from the top, that can only be reinforced by policy, practice, tools, and training. I commend the activities of D&I Haynes and others in government who have begun to utilize the release of current classified information to influence the decisions that are made in national security and operational contexts, such as we've seen in the run-up to Ukraine and in dealing with China as a rising power. That's a signal that it's a possible thing to consider, but it is only at the highest level that people are granted the privilege to think that way. And we have to figure out a way to train people and support the change in behavior that they can actually question, does this really need to be classified? I cannot tell you how many emails I received back in the day when I was living every day in classified. Hey, do you want to go to lunch? And somebody has a default classifier. You can actually set a default. Everyone is going to say this thing. And that is emblematic, I think, of the challenge and the drivers for it.
So this committee, we're going to look at all of the different drivers that are involved, but I just want to ask specifically about one that you mentioned, Ms. Goitein mentioned as well, artificial intelligence and machine learning. Something this committee is investigating. We had a hearing last week about the promises of artificial learning, but also the concerns and the challenges associated with it, and we have to think that through. So and you mentioned in your testimony how machine learning and artificial intelligence gives us a tool to manage massive amount of data, which we know that's appropriate to be thinking about. But tell the committee not just the opportunities, but talk to us about the pitfalls of using artificial intelligence and machine learning to deal with this issue?
Well, I think the greatest concern would be where decision rights lay on the product that the AI puts forth, right? To whether or not that would require review. If we have petabytes of data to search through to find the needle that is of the public interest, and then to have it considered as a needle found and not thinking about the whole haystack, I think that is ultimately a decision that rests with a human, but it has been served up and through a process that's trusted and demonstrably so in the technological ways, to then say, here are the few needles that you need to think about, and the argument to protect or not protect can be judged based on that.
Thank you. We'll come back to you later over the time. I want to get Ms. Goyden in here. You talked about the classification or declassification process after 25 years and mentioned why we have a backlog and why that's not working effectively in your opening comments. But I'd like you to drill down more, give us some specifics as to why that is failing and things that this committee should consider changing, and maybe not just having a flat 25 years or perhaps just enforcing that. I'd love your thoughts.
Absolutely. As I mentioned, the executive order says that all information of permanent historical value must be automatically declassified at 20 years, whether or not it has been, 25 years, whether or not it has been reviewed, and that's a quote. But in practice, a lot of the documents don't even get to the National Archives. They're not even accessioned until the agencies have performed their own manual review, nothing automatic about it. And there are 9 categories of information that are exempt from automatic declassification. So in theory, that's what they are looking for. They're also looking to see if other agencies might have equities in those documents, and then they will send the documents to those other agencies. That often happens sequentially, which adds a lot of time. Some of these 9 exemptions, if you add them all together, they cover a lot of ground, probably too much ground, and some of them are worded extremely broadly, so they give the agencies a lot of discretion. If the agencies find a single word that needs to remain classified, that's exempt, they will withhold the entire document rather than simply redacting that word. That's called a pass-fail approach. In addition, there's a statute, the Kyle-Lott Amendment is what it's called, that requires agencies to do a line-by-line review of these documents unless they can certify that the documents are highly unlikely to contain any nuclear information. And these agencies are extremely risk-averse. They're not going to designate large categories of information as being highly unlikely. So the combination of this sequential, lengthy manual review with a pass-fail approach with the Kyle-Lott Amendment means not only that this process takes years and years, but also that an extremely unimpressive percentage of documents come out the other side of this process declassified. So roughly half of documents that are reviewed end up being declassified, and there's a backlog of about 600 million pages of documents that haven't even been reviewed. That's what automatic declassification looks like today.
Right. 600 million pages, line by line.
That's a lot of work.
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck. So definitely we need reforms. Ranking Member Paul, recognized for your questions.
It was a great panel today. We rarely have an issue where both sides seem to agree on it. I think one suggestion would be if we were to do a bipartisan bill trying to fix this problem, that we constitute a working group, including the 4 members who have testified here today, since they probably have more experience in this issue than any members of Congress, any senators, or any of our staff. And if we had a working committee with these 4 and a few others, I think we would avoid the pitfall of having good intentions and then passing something that doesn't work, which is a pretty common occurrence in government. I think there's a lot of reasons why it doesn't work, but one of the fundamental things is the separation of power. And almost everything that we ever do here where we give an exemption to the executive to allow them to have the unilateral power, they use it. When it's well-intended, we say, well, you have to do this unless national security superimposes, but they always use that, and they will always have the incentive to use it. So we either have to have congressional power over funding or some sort of independent agency I almost would imagine sort of like a federal judge or somebody that has judicial experience to sort of review these, but has the power to make the decision, or if the executive makes a decision, it has to be appealed by Congress. Congress has to somehow be able to override, or somebody has to be able to override the presidential decision. Now, the question I had for Mr. Blanton was, you mentioned that there was a committee that was working, that was reviewing this. Was this just old documents over 25 years, or was this more recent documents? You mentioned some oversight committee that seemed to be working that was now backlogged.
The Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel.
I don't know why I couldn't remember that.
Yeah, no wonder you couldn't. We call it ICECAP.
ICECAP,
Because
okay.
it rules for the requester. And it got totally backlogged because it actually started ruling for the requester.
Was it old, over 25 years, or new?
Mandatory
newer stuff?
declassification review, so it can be new or old.
Okay.
New or old.
And it worked at first, but now it's overwhelmed because they have too much stuff.
Because the agencies didn't take those decisions and plug them back into the classification guides. There was no learning. So we had to fight those battles over and over and over, same
So
battles.
that could be part of the reform legislation,
Exactly.
is making sure that those decisions become a precedent for another decision, another
Exactly.
similar decision.
Exactly. And I just point back to your reference to the Moynihan Commission. The title of that commission was Protecting and Reducing Government Secrets. It sounds like contradiction. It's not. If you protect the real secrets, you got to disgorge the non-secrets.
I've been to hundreds of classified hearings and never heard anything classified, and most of the important stuff is already in the newspaper, and I read about it in the newspaper, and some of it's just ridiculous. The idea that the FBI and the Department of Energy have concluded that they think this, in all likelihood, came from the lab in Wuhan is not a secret. If you had somebody's name, that's a secret. I've never been to a hearing where I was told a name of a source or how somebody got something, and really, frankly, I don't want to know it for any possibility of that leaking. So there are real secrets that we have, but almost nothing that is classified is a real secret. Ms. Goyton, is that right? Close?
Goitin.
Goytin.
Thank you.
Mentioned in a written testimony that a wedding ceremony in Dagestani, cables from that were classified. You know what kind of robes they wore and what they did over this wedding ceremony. That's ridiculous. But I was told just yesterday by the Secretary of State he will not give me any cables, and he will not give me any information that's unclassified because the executive branch has unilaterally decided they will not give information unless a chairman of a committee signs off on it. So I have 4 or 5 chairmen I'm trying to get to sign records releases. They will not give any. But who made this decision? Not Congress, not the people. They made the decision to protect it. But this is the problem we have. I want to fix the classified problem, but even the unclassified information they're withholding from us. I want to see like government grants on people who applied for coronavirus research that were rejected, accepted, what the research proposal involved that involved the lab in Wuhan. I can't get it, because they deny this, and most of it's not supposed to be classified. So we have a real problem. It's even worse than that. Some committee chairman will say, like the head of Armed Services will say, we'll sign a request for this information, but it's not supposed to leave the committee. There's a report that they did in Help Committee, and I'm on both committees, and I wanted to bring it over here because I'm the ranking member. The Help Committee is preventing me from bringing that over so Senator Peters can see it. I mean, it's crazy, the segmentation of the things we do. But I think the best way to fix it is I really think it would be a great idea to have like a working group of people from the outside that would help us craft the information so we don't have the same pitfalls. What I'd hate is we do rubber stamp of something that looks good, sounds good, and doesn't work. And it really has to involve all of this. And so the reforms, you talked about having them learn from the precedents. Any other reforms, Mr. Eddington, that you would suggest?
You know, an awful lot of what my colleagues have already talked about, I think, is essential. But I'll just point to previous success stories. We've talked about a lot of failures here. But things happen when Congress decide they need to happen. So this is how we get the JFK records assassination material out, the Imperial-Japanese war crimes and Nazi war crimes records out. So this is stuff coming directly from the Congress. That's why in my written statement, I propose a national declassification bill, essentially, that would mandate essentially that anything that's 25 years old or older shall be essentially presumed to be unclassified unless there are very specific criteria that are met. Now, the criteria that I talk about are drawn from the existing executive order, 13526, but there are important words that are not in that executive order. Eliza has pointed to some of them. My favorite word is current. That word does not appear in there, so that's what gives NSA and others the ability to hang on to stuff for 50 years, 75 years, 100 years. So that's the number one thing. On the issue of congressional prerogatives, let's remember that the word secret only appears in the Constitution in one place. It's not Article 2. It's Article 1, Section 5, dealing with this body, Congress. Congress was the original classification authority. It let that power essentially slip away to the executive branch. And in my judgment, that's exactly the reason we have a problem. The last group of your colleagues who I think really understood this well were Senator Church, Senator Tower, and the others on the Church Committee, because when they were doing their report, they made it very clear to President Ford, we're going to listen to you when we tell you what we're going to include in this report, but the final word about what goes into our product, our committee report, that's us, that's Congress. That is exactly the standard you all need to return to. Do not turn your material, do not turn your reports over to the executive branch and let them tell you what is or is not classified. You are the original classification authority, and that's in the black letter text of the Constitution. Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. You're recognized for your questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to you and to the ranking member for having this hearing. You know, we attend a lot of classified briefings, and I would say at the end of probably more than half of them, I say to the briefers, often very high-ranking members at the Pentagon or in the intelligence community, you know, our adversaries know we know what you've just told us. We know our adversaries know that they know we know. We know they know we know. The only ones who don't know are the American people. And very often, it is information that is vital to the American people assessing a threat to our national security. And if I began to tell you now what those subjects are, I'd get in a lot of trouble. Nobody would shoot me, but I would be, in effect, shot on the floor of the United States Senate, become a major issue. Blumenthal discloses classified briefing. So the real losers here are the American people, not about some historic event 25 years ago, but about current threats to our national security, where we could mobilize more support publicly for defense spending in certain areas if the American people knew what the ongoing threats are. And sometimes, and I'm going to be somewhat adventurous here, the information we get is from aerial surveillance, where companies in the private sector are already producing the information because they got satellites just like our military does. And I have seen aerial surveillance of the balloon that went over our country, the Chinese balloon, which traces it back to when it originated, not from the Pentagon, but from a private company doing the same kind of aerial surveillance. The present system is beyond broken. It is actually counterproductive. It promotes secrecy at the expense of our national interest and security, simply to prevent often embarrassment to public officials who would prefer that the public not see what they are doing. And we all would love to be the final arbiters of what the public knows about what we're doing, but it doesn't happen that way in a democracy. And I've seen the history here. You go through it in your testimony. Nothing has happened after every one of these commissions. Nothing. None of the Moynihan recommendations adopted. So when we sort of preach here, meaning we on the panel preach, not you, it really is not necessarily a sign that we're going to accomplish something now. But I would like to take some of these recommendations, for example, from the Moynihan Commission, and propose them in a more comprehensive way rather than piecemeal in the way that we've adopted doing it. I don't know that it would require another commission. But I'd like to know from you if you were to prioritize 5 recommendations made by the Moynihan Commission or by one of the other numerous bodies that have made recommendations, what would they be? And I know we won't have time necessarily to go into all of your suggestions or recommendations, but it would be helpful, I think, to get the 5 things, taking Senator Paul's apt remark that the experts are here, we don't need to form a commission with you folks on it, but something really ought to be done, and the American people want an end to this secrecy for all the reasons that have been stated in a very forceful bipartisan way. So, I'm happy to begin going down the line. We'll run out of time, and so your written responses, I think, would be very helpful.
I'll try to be quick because I know all of us are going to have ideas. And I was looking at the list that I had, the summary of the recommendations that I made in my written testimony, and I had basically 10 sets of recommendations. So I was just choosing the top 5. But certainly I think we need to start with technology, development and implementation of advanced technologies. You're not going to find that in some of the older commission's reports, but it is key to the success of the system now. I mentioned in my oral remarks that we should have a White House-led task force to narrow the criteria for classification, that we should require agencies to have accountability systems for overclassification. I think that's very important. There are other ways as well to rebalance the incentives that I mentioned in my written testimony. And then reforming automatic declassification by empowering the National Declassification Center to declassify documents without lengthy agency review, but also to include what's called a drop-dead date. This is what Tom was speaking about earlier. It's a sunset, which is a period of time after which documents would simply cease to be classified. They wouldn't have to be declassified. And then the last one is that I think Congress should amend the provision of the National Security Act that talks about protecting against the unauthorized disclosure of sources and methods, because that provision has been misconstrued to allow and even require the withholding of sources and methods regardless of whether their disclosure would actually harm national security. So those are my top 5.
I totally agree, and I could stop there, but I would just add the top recommendation of the Moynihan-Helms-Combest Commission was for Congress to pass a statute to authorize the classification system and take that away from the executive orders that just make a mishmash of the whole thing. A statute, and then in that statute, the core principles of that statute need to be what Liza just said, that any withholding of any kind, not just classified area, but in the unclassified areas that Senator Paul's talking about, executives should have to identify the harm from release and have a balance test against the benefit from release, cost-benefit analysis, harm test. And to come back to my own testimony, sunsets on the front end will compel better thinking by the original classifiers because they got to make a risk assessment that right now is just a drop-down menu. Oh, want to go to lunch? Oh, is that secret or confidential or, right? That's all it is, a drop. It's as reflexive as the old days when it was a rubber stamp, except it's a drop-down menu. So a statute and then those balancing pieces on the front end and on the back end. I think that's the core.
Very briefly, I would suggest attention to one of the recommendations the PIDB made in an earlier report around prioritization. While we are working on capabilities that can deal with data and paper and digits in the aggregate, something needs to be done now, or one thing that can be done now is for the Congress to use its voice to indicate what the public interest is, right? In the ways that Patrick was talking about with the JFK assassination records. It does not have to be as an auspicious and historical event as that, but if there's one that hasn't been addressed, put that out there as a priority for the NDC and the agencies to work on, to show a good outcome for the classification system. Prioritization is a difficult challenge, but I think a necessary one for separating the wheat from the chaff that's in the 600 million pages of unreviewed documents and other big piles. Thank you.
In my written statement, Senator Blumenthal, I have essentially model legislation that would do an awful lot of what Tom and Liza are talking about. So I agree with Dr. Paul. If you put the four of us in a room over a weekend, we could probably give you a pretty nearly finished version of what you might want to take a look at. So I'll leave it there.
Well, and we will, we'll be continuing to work. We're working with all of you so far. We're going to continue to work with you so we get something done. So we'll make sure that happens. I need to step away for another committee hearing briefly to ask some questions downstairs. Ranking Member Paul will take the gavel until I return.
Senator Marshall.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member, I do sincerely appreciate holding this hearing. As senators, we all take an oath to defend the Constitution. And what I've seen as a senator, that not only am I not allowed to see much of the information we need, whether it's classified or unclassified, but certainly America doesn't. Whenever we allow the federal government to live in darkness, it's a threat to our Constitution and a threat to our republic. I way underestimated how important this transparency issue is and how we're all more accountable when things are out in the open. So certainly I'm a frustrated senator right now and want to do what we can do to, it seems like the de facto position is to classify things as opposed to the de facto position of let Americans see it. So my first question is for Mr. Fitzpatrick. Under President Clinton, it took a year for the NSC senior director to basically update this overclassification issue. I don't mean to make you defensive. I'm sure you wanted to do something as well. You had 4 years to make an impact on this. You had committees and meetings, and what progress did you make? But more importantly, what were the obstacles for you to update the classification system?
Well, I served in the last year of the Obama NSC and 2.5-ish years of the Trump NSC. So the Obama NSC, my time there, that was that administration's executive order, 13526. It did not, it was the state of the order that administration wanted, and so it was not a priority to conduct another policy review on an executive order it had issued. Which is not to say it didn't revise, any administration doesn't revise its own orders. That was not a priority. In fact, my timing coming into the administration was focused on wrapping things up for that administration and the transition to the next. It was also not established as a policy priority in the Trump administration. And so the attention for my office, which came down through the chief of staff there, did not prioritize that work. I point this out explicitly and point back to my testimony, which suggests that it will take an external force or a congressional mandate to establish a requirement that the president prioritize this work and report back on specific milestones and outcomes. That example worked, and I used the security clearance reform example in my testimony. I've often referred to the security clearance reform problem as the #1 second-tier national security issue in government, and knowing that the national security community never gets out of tier 1. Wow. Overclassification, my opinion and estimate, a tier 3 issue. It's not, without somebody, it's a peripheral activity in government. Without somebody taking that and putting it at the center and within the focus of leadership and you know, when a leader...
Is it a priority for this administration, do you think? Is this a priority? You sound like...
I'm not able to speak for this administration. I am familiar that they have issued some guidance to agencies to bring ideas forth, but I'm not familiar with the status of it.
Mr. Blanton, my next question for you. Would a 2-tiered classification system work better than the current 3? If so, would you force agencies to move all of information currently classified as confidential down to unclassified or unclassified for official use only, as opposed to raising it to secret? Would that diminish overclassification?
It's a great question, Senator. My view is we got to disgorge the confidential level material, not just change the label on it. And it goes back to something I mentioned to Chairman Peters at the very beginning. Yesterday, inspired by Liza's optimistic belief in machine learning, I asked ChatGPT your question.
There you go.
How should we modernize this nation's information security system?
I've been waiting for this.
And let me tell you, answer number one, this system is way too simple. It doesn't even begin to comprehend the multiple threats that we face, such as in cyber, the limited number of labels, we need more of them, and then it ended with an error message. So we tasked it again. Second time, ChatGPT says, no, the problem with the security classification systems is there's 3 levels of secrecy. There should only be 2, secret and top secret. Didn't get an error message after that. I think they've been listening to the Public Declass Board.
This system agrees with Senator Marshall, it sounds like. All
I
right.
think the problem there is just simply the bureaucratic imperative, and that we've all heard about.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go back to Mr. Fitzpatrick. Why has ISO been so ineffective overseeing the classification system and holding agencies accountable for overclassification?
I think it's challenged on a resource basis. In order to actually oversee the activities of the classification system, it's necessary to measure them, which ISO does, but it's also necessary to go and visit agencies and conduct inspections and see exactly how the numbers that come back in reports are arrived at by the agencies. And the staffing levels of ISO has been reduced to a point where it cannot do that effectively.
Okay. Yeah, my next question, I'll go back to you, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and others can chime in if they want to add to this. How can we ensure the United States government releases all of the JFK records in our lifetime? You know, this seems to be the bar that America is like, if this is shrouded in secrecy, this sad chapter of America's life, if this is shrouded in secrecy, everything else is as well.
I suppose a review of those statutory requirements in that law, in light of the releases that have come and the withholding that has resulted from that guidance, might produce a different set of criteria to force the outcome that you state.
Mr. Eddington, would you add anything?
Senator, you and your colleagues have the power, if necessary, to provide additional funding if that's a problem. I don't know whether that's necessarily the case or not, but if there is any doubt as to whether or not additional information is out there, give them a drop-dead deadline. You know, I think that Tom and I have a mind meld on the Vulcan-type mind meld on this practically. Give them an absolute deadline on this stuff. And then, and I have to say, I'm an Article I guy, have GAO literally climb all over them and take a look as to whether or not they have actually been as thorough as they should have been in looking for documents. We don't have enough, and Tom has talked about this a lot, we don't have enough back-end checks on this stuff. This is why we have a problem with surveillance in this country. I hate to keep coming back to this. I know this is supposed to be about dealing with the classification system, but there's almost never enough back-end checks on this stuff, and not enough auditing. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of times you all end up legislating in the dark. You have an opportunity to fix that here, if you choose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thanks so much to the panel. Great answers.
Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Paul, and thanks to all of our witnesses for being here today. I want to start with a question to Ms. Goitin, please. Government's top priority is to keep its citizens safe, secure, and free. Classifying certain information is important to protecting national security, such as intelligence sources and methods, to be sure. But this committee has also heard from experts in the public and private sectors about the challenges with information sharing between government agencies and critical infrastructure owners and operators, right? So when we think about cyber in particular right now, what I hear from the private sector is we can't get any information that would help us do what we need to do to keep safe. It's information sharing necessary to help prevent terrorist attacks, combat cyber threats, and more. So in your experience, Ms. Goitin, how have you seen overclassification inhibit information sharing that's critical to public safety and security?
Thank you for that question. I think it is a major problem, and in fact, the 9/11 Commission talked about overclassification and how overclassification had actually stood in the way of sharing information among intelligence agencies that could have helped to prevent the attacks. So we paid a heavy price, possibly, for overclassifying information. What the 9/11 Commission pointed to was a culture of secrecy that is a relic of a Cold War. And that culture, which pervades a lot of the agencies we're talking about, is rooted in assumptions from the Cold War about who the enemy was and what we had to do to protect ourselves against the enemy that no longer hold. And as you're pointing out, in today's threat environment, sharing information is often critical to protecting national security. So that really is an enormous problem, and it raises its head in all kinds of areas. My written testimony has some other examples of situations where failure to share information has been problematic. I also, if I could, want to just briefly respond to Senator Marshall's question about whether this is a priority for this administration. I did want to point out that the National Security Council last June began an interagency process to look at the executive order and the classification system. That process, at least at the time, was given a year. If this administration comes out with an executive order that includes all the reforms we're talking about today in June, that will greatly diminish the need for legislation, although Congress will still need to ensure that there are adequate funds. However, if it appears that no such order is forthcoming in the near future or in the foreseeable future, or if the order doesn't have adequate reforms, then again, that's the situation where I really think Congress needs to step in to protect democratic accountability, the rule of law, oversight, and, as you said, national security.
Well, I appreciate that very much, and that's a good marker for us to look at. I want to talk to you, too, Ms. Goyton, about the financial costs here. I am chair of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Spending Oversight, which is tasked with protecting and saving taxpayer dollars. Toward that end, I am concerned about ways in which overclassification of federal documents contributes to waste, fraud, and abuse. So what are the financial consequences of overclassification? Specifically, what factors contribute to those consequences?
Overclassification greatly increases the amount of effort and resources that need to be put into protecting the information. It also requires costs to be spent on clearing secure personnel. I think the reason we have, over 4 million people who have security clearance to access classified information is because even people who are performing relatively low-level or non-sensitive tasks actually need a clearance to do their work. And certainly the systems that are used to process classified information, the physical storage for classified information, all of these cost money. I think we don't even know how much money they cost. The last figure that we have, which is from a few years ago, I think, is $18 billion. But the director of ISOO has flagged in various ways that he's not confident in the accuracy of that information. And I think it's likely to actually be much more than that. And of course, we are not talking about the indirect costs, the inefficiencies and the weaknesses in some of the policies that are a result of information not being shared and vetted and improved through transparency and public participation.
Well, and does overclassification allow federal agencies to hide waste, fraud, and abuse?
Absolutely. It's one of the main reasons, I think, why why the classification system is misused.
I want to follow up with you on that, but I want to get to a couple of more questions. A question to Mr. Fitzpatrick. The backlog of government documents that are overdue for declassification is large, as you have noted, and likely too big to be addressed by human review alone, as we were just talking about. And you touched on this already with Senator Peters and with Senator Marshall, but we've talked about technology solutions that can assist federal workers in addressing the backlog without jeopardizing ongoing security matters. But based on your experience in the federal government, which federal agency should lead or be involved in developing these technology solutions?
Well, thank you for the question. It's incredibly important. I believe that the information technology budget of the U.S. government is already spending dollars on automated artificial intelligence and machine language. So one of the challenges here is to take the solutions that are being built for other purposes and apply them to this problem, right? And it would take somebody at the federal CIO level, and my recommendation, guided by an ISU director that is charged with the responsibility to say, listen to these agencies, they are starved of these resources. If they had them, here's what they would do. So the ideas are there. The technology application is, I think, the key thing, and it has to happen from the OMB budget level.
Okay, thank you. One last quick question to Ms. Goyton. You testified that the federal government's current incentive and penalty structure encourages individuals to err on the side of overclassifying information rather than declassifying information. At the same time, classification is obviously essential to protecting national security interests. So how do you recommend striking the right balance between reducing incentives to overclassify while protecting our national security?
Well, I think we'd have to go a long way in the other direction before we had to worry that we were making it too easy for people to not classify information. So I think there's a lot of room to work with. I do think absolutely there need to be administrative penalties for mishandling classified information, failing to protect classified information in cases where it's quite clear that that information required protection. But one thing that I think does need to be done is to provide a safe harbor for officials who make good faith decisions not to classify or not to mark information in situations where the classification status of that information truly is ambiguous. And right now, I don't think officials feel free to exercise their judgment, their reasonable judgment in that direction. And then on the flip side, as I was saying earlier, we need to have some kind of accountability for people who are misusing the classification system for reasons unrelated to national security.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Heston. Senator Langford, you're recognized for your
Sure,
questions.
and thank you. Thank you all for bringing your testimony. Really appreciate your engagement. I was able to sit in earlier and be able to hear your oral statements, and I'm back and forth in multiple hearings today, so I appreciate your engagement and your thoughtfulness on this. Quick story, went to the National Archives, I don't know, several years ago, and I said, show me something that people don't get to see. And so they pulled out a hand-done drawing of Pearl Harbor, and it had X's on it and markings on it. And I said, what am I looking at? They said this was a radar operator at Pearl Harbor that was tracking the Japanese coming in, and everywhere there's an X, it's when he radioed in and said to the folks at Pearl, I'm picking up a radio signal. And they signaled back, it must be people flying in from California. And there were like 5 X's, and then it stops. And they said this document was highly classified for decades because it showed we knew the Japanese were coming and missed it. And so it stayed classified for decades. Here it is. It was an interesting dialogue, and it was also an educational moment for me to be able to hear classification and how it's used historically and how it can still be used today. My question's on a couple of things on this. There is a flip side of this. There are covert operations that do happen that protect our national security worldwide, that some of them do last decades. And as long as we have that penetration, it stays classified. So if we do an automatic declassification in 25 years, that can threaten covert operations, but we also have the Pearl Harbor map that it's just someone trying to cover up their mistake as well that's out there. So there are multiple layers of classifications. You've got sensitive, you've got classified, you've got top classified, you've got covert operations, you've got compartmented, you've got all these different pieces here. How do we strike a balance on automatic declassification and still protect covert operations that are still ongoing? Ready, set, go.
As the CIA guy, why don't I go first, or former CIA guy? I'll go first here. I wholeheartedly agree with you, Senator Langford, which is why in the proposal that I have put forward, and I'll just talk about confidential human sources because that's also an area where I think the time scale can be similar to what you're talking about.
You got family members that can be exposed, even if that person's gone, their family's still around.
That's exactly right. So, you know, in my proposal, I'm focusing here on current confidential human sources, and by current, I mean whereby they have provided information on criminal activity, let's say in an FBI or other law enforcement context, or information of a foreign intelligence value within the last 5 years. Now, you know, if that's the case, that's going to get extended out for a very long period of time, so long as that's an active source. It's possible that we would need to talk about maybe some tweaks to what I've, you know, discussed here, but I think that kind of approach that recognizes that when something ends and there is no, you know, life at stake, if you will, the information ought to be available in a much more timely way than it is right now. But I absolutely take your point with respect to covert action, and I want to make sure that obviously we don't go anywhere other than the unclassified here. There are absolutely activities that take place that do stretch literally over decades, and we would want to make sure that those kinds of activities are protected. That being said, one of the cores of my proposal here involves an absolute prohibition on using the classification system in any circumstance to hide waste, fraud, abuse, criminal conduct, et cetera. And I think you need to have that in place because, you know, as Liza has indicated, and I have many examples that I can share with the committee, the classification system has been repeatedly misused to conceal those very kinds of things. So that's my quick take on that. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
The solution that I have advocated for declassification involves removing multi-agency equity reviews at the 25-year mark, but not getting rid of the exemptions at that point. I have advocated having this steering committee, this working group, led by the White House, narrow those criteria because I think they're too broad. But certainly some of the examples you were giving, those would still be exempt from declassification. We just wouldn't have a multi-year, endless process and these open-ended exemptions that result in almost or not enough information being disclassified. Even the drop dead date that I mentioned, which is further on in time, roughly 40 years is what I put forward. Even at that point, there would be categories of information that should be exempted. Those would include confidential human sources and key design concepts of weapons of mass destruction. And there would be an option for agencies to seek case-by-case exceptions beyond those that could be approved by ISCAP. But the key distinction there, again, is that the information would not have to be declassified. If it didn't fall within one of these exceptions that I've mentioned, it would simply cease to be classified, and that's the key there. So these solutions that we are talking about would absolutely preserve the government's ability to keep secret the very narrow category of information that really does need to still be secret after 25 or 40 years.
We have had a new designation show up recently on documents that get brought over to our staff. It has for official use only, law enforcement sensitive. And the first time we saw it, we're like, what does that even mean? And this is not something that's in a SCIF. This is just something that appears as a new designation. Magically, there is a new setting, and they're basically like, we don't want this out, so we're going to create a designation for this. Now, we have done what we should do with that. We've ignored that and said that's not a real designation on it. But there's this constant push to say we're not going to be able to get information out, and we don't want to release out to the public on it. So we understand the challenge that we're on dealing with any administration. I do really like the concept of having a place of appeal, basically. I don't know how many documents that we get that are redacted, that the whole page is black, basically, with redactions on it, and we have no place to appeal to go fight for it. Often we end up FOIAing the documents, or some outside group does, and they get it, and we don't on it. That's absurd on it. But to have a place of appeal that's set up, what we were talking about before, would be helpful, so we're not fighting an agency saying it's my document and I'll tell you what's classified and what's not. So, Mr. Fitzpatrick, you were leaning on the button like you want to say something.
No, I think you make an excellent point about the realm of information control that happens outside of what is defined as classified national security information. And I was smiling at your words because there is not a defined meaning for FOUO, right? There are, and there was, again, to the point Liza made about the post-9/11 information share and connect the dots efforts that happened in the early 2000s, realizing that the challenge of too much information control blinded, perhaps, our ability to see this threat coming. But the discovery of that as a problem, the study rather of that as a problem, revealed that there's 118 different FOUOs, right? And then the Obama administration The Bush administration had some recommendations about controlled unclassified information. The Obama administration had a different take that tried to limit the ability of a government agency to utilize a control like that and to make them more uniform. And what was discovered in that process, which was to say only agencies who have a law, regulation, or government-wide policy can put controls on information. If it says you can control this information, only you can do that. The number of times that appears in statute and regulation is far more than anybody thought, and the oceans of information that it covers is far more than anybody thought. And so what was hoped to be a limiting and a transparency initiative actually uncovered this vast ability to control more, or what could be controlled. And so it has not succeeded in releasing more information.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Langford. Senator Johnson, recognized for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, you brought up, or Senator Marshall brought up, the JFK files. I'd recommend anybody that's interested in that to read the JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas, and you'll find out why the agencies are probably still reluctant to actually release more of that information. But again, that's information from yesteryear that's important to reveal the truth about history. I want to talk about information in the here and now, that we need to govern action in the here and now, to fix problems in the here and now. And I would argue, and let's also set aside classified information, let's just talk about unclassified information that we do not have access to. Mr. Douglas, you talked about how Congress has willingly given away its classification authority. We've also allowed our oversight capabilities to completely atrophy, or almost completely atrophy. We've allowed that to happen. There's no enforcement mechanism. Now, I want to use the example I used yesterday in the Finance Committee with Secretary Becerra. I asked him, first of all, Mr. Secretary, do you think it's important that we understand where the coronavirus came from? He said, absolutely. And I said, well, what is your agency, HHS, are you leading an effort to determine that? And kind of some gobbledygook, and then he said, well, but we're not getting cooperation. I said, well, interesting you said that. We're not getting cooperation from your agency. And then I gave him a couple examples. There's two areas that the American public can get information out of the government. One is FOIA requests, and unfortunately that often has to go through a court and have that be court-ordered, although it shouldn't be, and then through congressional oversight, right? So I have two examples of both. This was a document. These are the famous Anthony Fauci emails, okay? Through a FOIA request, people got them early, and what we did is shortly after, we had 5 members of this committee. There's actually a law, 5 U.S.C. 2954, that says if 5 members of this committee request information, the government shall provide it, right? So under that statute, we wrote the letter. We got this document, okay? This is dated February 4th. The classification here is the exception 4 is why it's redacted. And that has to do with trade secrets or confidential, commercial, or financial information. This is the same document recently produced under FOIA to the general public. It's not redacted. So now I know what's under the redactions. Serial passage in ACE2 transgenic mice. That's what was covered up. This Anthony Fauci with question marks going. This is in February 4th. He's already recognizing that maybe the coronavirus came from a lab, from experiments with those humanized mice. That was denied Congress in our oversight capability. A couple days earlier, similar type of thing. This is what we got in congressional oversight, all redacted. This is what was obtained under FOIA request. So again, we can see under the redactions now. Okay, again, not because the agency gave it to us, because a court ordered it. It's interesting, this is classified under exception number 5, which is deliberative process, inter or intra-agency communications. What's interesting about this email chain, it includes Jeremy Ferrara of the Wellcome Trust. He doesn't work for U.S. government agencies, so you've already blown the privilege in terms of confidentiality, but it's, so again, they're not following the law. Through the accommodation process, we asked for all 4,000 pages. We narrowed it down to 400. They wouldn't give them to us. They allowed us to read it in a reading room. We could take notes, no copies. Over the course of a year, up until about January 2022, we got 350 of the 400 pages we requested. Since January 2022, we've been fighting tooth and nail for the last 50 pages. This is what we've gotten. This is what the FOIA request got, okay? This is what it looks like. Okay? There's obviously some important information in this last 50 pages, and we can't get it. Now, I will say the only reason we got the 350 pages is because Chairman Ossoff, to his credit, as chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee Investigation, I'm ranking member, signed a request for these documents and then made some phone calls to start the process of production to us. And so my message is mainly targeted or directed to Chairman Peters and Chairman Blumenthal. Congress has to reclaim its oversight capability. We need some kind of enforcement mechanism. Okay, I'd love to pass a law. But again, we've got laws on the books. They're not complying with the laws. They are flagrantly not complying with the laws. But there's no enforcement mechanism. They know that. The administration knows that, so this problem just gets worse. So the only mechanism we have right now is public pressure, obtained by bipartisan efforts. So my plea, Mr. Chairman, is join us in these requests for information that the American public deserves. There should be nothing partisan about the origin of COVID. It's our response to COVID occurred under 2 administrations. There's nothing partisan about that. This is information the public deserves to know, but also policy makers need to know so we can act, so we can fix problems. Because I don't think anybody can take a look at our response to COVID and say it was a dramatic success. No, it was a miserable failure. Mr. Edding, the question I have for you is, particularly in a political environment, when you've got the White House controlled by one party and a branch of Congress controlled by that same party, I mean, if the administration just gives us the middle finger, there's just no enforcement mechanism. We can't even hold them in contempt. And if we are to hold them in contempt, if you have a political party in one chamber able to do that, the Department of Justice is not going to prosecute that. What kind of enforcement mechanism can we have for Congress to reclaim its oversight authority?
Senator Johnson, thank you very much for the question. The impeachment mechanism can be used against any civil officer of the government, from the President of the United States on down to the most lowly GS5 clerk. So, to borrow your paradigm here, one of the things that frustrated me when I worked in the House of Representatives was learning that when Speaker Pelosi had the opportunity to put an end to the Stellar Wind program, the illegal warrantless surveillance program, which FISA Section 702 is the grandchild of, she claimed that she had no authority to act, she didn't have staff in the room, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she's a very bright woman, a very, very capable woman. What I couldn't understand for the life of me is why she didn't ask for everybody's business cards. And you're probably wondering why. After she had collected those business cards, she should have thanked them and said, I just needed to make sure that I had your names right so I could get them spelled correctly by legislative counsel for the impeachment resolution that I'm going to introduce against you, all of you. So respectfully, and I do mean this respectfully, you do have a tool. And I'd be willing to bet that a certain gentleman from Ohio, who happens to be heading up a specific subcommittee or committee in the House of Representatives, would probably be willing to work with you to begin to incentivize bureaucrats within the executive branch to follow the law. That's my recommendation, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Addington.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Ranking Member Paul has some remaining questions. You're recognized for it.
Well, I joined Senator Johnson in hoping we can get bipartisan, requests for records. And one of the arguments for it to do it on our side is the records eventually are going to come out on the other side, and basically Republicans only are going to lead the charge and the explanation and the expose of those records. If we were to do it on this side in a bipartisan way, we would be able to access those records, and there'll be another interpretation, both of us together or separately, of these records. If we have to wait till the other side gets out, it'll look like we've stonewalled them, they get the records, but then it's going to be all basically a Republican investigation. One other item I just wanted to get to was while we all seem to agree on the problem, we all seem to agree on a lot of the solutions, the one thing that sometimes divides us is how we pay for things. And there was some mention of needing more resources. I think that's dollars. When we look at this, it's my hope that instead of always we just say, well, we need $10 billion more, well, where is someplace we could actually take it from? And so I hope you will think about that. I think that it was sort of tangentially mentioned, if you have a sunset on things, that might save some money because you don't have to go through a gazillion records because you've sunsetted them. We might want to put a dollar aspect on that if we're developing a bill over many months. Let's put a dollar amount on automatic sunsets and getting through a lot of that. That could be a lot of savings that could be freed up to go to the committee that has to review this, that doesn't have enough resources. Also, if we classified less on the front end. Now, how do you get the executive branch to classify? One other thought I have is that maybe each executive branch that classifies things, it should come out of their existing budget. So what if the budget of HHS, well, I don't know why they would be classifying things, but if HHS wants to classify things, maybe they got to say, oh no, it's going to cost me $1 billion in my budget to do it, so it's a disincentive to classify. But ways of shifting cost as opposed to all being new costs. I'm not opposed to some cost, but I think if we can take it, we just already give $1 gazillion to everybody. Let's try to take something they're using inappropriately and make it use appropriately. Does anybody have an idea on that, Eliza?
Yeah, I think it's really striking that the security classification budgets that agencies have are devoted overwhelmingly to classifying and protecting information and not to declassifying information. The percentage of those budgets that are spent on declassification, the last set of statistics that are available, I think the percentage was 0.5% is spent on declassification. So one possibility is to require 10% of an agency's classification, security classification budget to be spent on declassification. Right there, that not only means more resources for declassification, also means less resources for classification. So it kind of takes on both. I don't think that will be enough. I think there will have to be extra resources. But as you have pointed out, I think there are enormous savings on the back end of this as well, and we have to take that into account.
Thank you, Ranking Member Paul. And I agree. I think this is a cost-saving mechanism, although there might be some transition cost if we're moving to AI systems, machine learning, and we've got to explore the pros and cons of all of that as well, but you'll need some investments. You have to sometimes make investment to save money, and as we're thinking that through, I think is important. So thank you. Keep thinking of those ideas. We're all about saving money and doing things more efficiently and thoughtful. And appreciate the four of you continuing in this discussion. And we will aggressively seek you out as we're working on legislation in a bipartisan way to accomplish this. So I want to first off just thank Ranking Member Paul again for holding this hearing with me here today. I'd also like to thank all of our witnesses. Thank you for taking time and joining us in this very important discussion and for providing further insights into how we improve the classification system to improve both transparency and efficiency. Today, our government creates a greater volume and variety of classified documents than we ever have in history. As we have heard from our witnesses, overclassification, outdated technology, inefficiencies in declassification all result in significant cost to the country, and an outdated classification system reduces public trust, inhibits government oversight, and threatens, quite frankly, our national security. Today's hearing has made clear that investing in technology like artificial intelligence, making classification and declassification work more efficiently, and incentivizing transparency can restore trust in how the government safeguards sensitive information. Additionally, your testimony has shown that Congress must take a more active role in the classification policy. And as chairman, I'm committed to working on bipartisan legislation, and I look forward to working with Ranking Paul on these issues in the coming weeks and months. The record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on April 7th of 2023 for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.